Welcome to Flipping the Table, where we have honest conversations about food, farming, and the future. Today, Michael speaks with Cole Mannix, co-founder of Old Salt Co-op based in the Blackfoot Valley of Montana. Old Salt is a new generation meat brand designed to ensure good meat for the families served, excellent land stewardship, and a vibrant ranching community. Cole shares details about the financial realities that are driving the co-op's ambitious plan to escape the unfair and unsustainable limits of the industrial meat system. Enjoy the show.
Hello, I'm very excited to share my conversation today with entrepreneurial Montana rancher Cole Mannix from Old Salt Co-op, which is an ambitious and exciting startup meat brand. Cole is among a large number of entrepreneurial farmers, ranchers, and meat processors from across the nation, many with unprecedented support from the USDA, who are aiming to establish viable, regionally focused alternatives to the oligopoly that is the industrial meat system. Now, this is not easy. The 5 industrial companies that control 85% of the nation's meat supply have enough money to accept losses for years in order to outcompete these startups. But we need alternatives like Old Salt Co-op because our nation is being harmed by the industrial meat system in at least 6 ways. First, on price. The small number of dominating factory meat companies enable them to pay the farmers and ranchers very little while charging high prices to the distributors and retailers who buy the meat to feed most of the nation. Second, these corporations keep us in the dark about the sources of meat. There is little to no transparency, and cheap meat from Brazil and Australia drive down prices for American producers who face more regulations that protect land, water, endangered species, and the workers. Third, these greedy corporations, several of which have been busted for using child labor, suck all the profits from rural communities from which the animals are originated, and they pass the immense wealth generated by meat sales to a few corporate executives and the shareholders. Fourth, grain-fed factory meat contains more LDL, the bad cholesterol, than grass-fed meat, and is generally a product of growth-enhancing antibiotics, which can lead to more antibiotic-resistant bacterial infections. Fifth, industrial meat is from livestock and poultry that lived in unnatural environments and were stressed for long periods, therefore less humane conditions. Finally, the low prices paid to farmers and ranchers makes it harder and riskier for them to change their operations by investing in the training, tools, infrastructures, and research that will reduce degradation of the environment, climate, and animal welfare. So, the meat oligopoly places the burden of repair and cleanup and enforcement of humane animal husbandry on public agencies funded by taxpayers. This also means that good stewards of land and animals must pay to be certified as good. Thus, the best farmers and ranchers are penalized for being good. And that is the context for our conversation today. Cole Mannix and his partners at Old Salt Co-op are the opposite of a greedy and exploitive meat factory. They are creating a brand based on strong values and responsibility for the community and our common future. Cole is part of an extended family that has ranched together since 1882. You will hear about the years away from the ranch and the education that led him to his leadership of a multifaceted meat enterprise. Cole and his team and other entrepreneurial efforts like it will succeed or fail based in part on the willingness of people in this country to become dedicated buyers of regional meats raised in ways that respect the earth, the animals, and the families that raise those animals. I found Cole to be a wonderfully compelling communicator, and I bet you will too. Let's begin. Cole Mannix, nice to meet you. Really glad you could join me today to talk about your venture.
Nice to meet you, Michael. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. I always like to start with an origin story and let people know where you are geographically and then how you came to do what you're doing now.
Yeah, I grew up in Western Montana in the Blackfoot Valley, so that would be Glacier Park, and just south of Glacier is the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex, and just south of that is this little valley where my family has ranched since the 1880s. So my mom and dad and dad's brothers and their spouses uh, ranched together, the same operation. And then I'm the oldest of my generation of siblings and cousins. And so grew up there, tiny little rural area that's sandwiched between Missoula and Helena. And those Missoula's probably 80,000 people, Helena 40,000, and Helmville probably has about 15 people that live on Main Street. And I was the only kid in my kindergarten through eighth. Most of kindergarten through eighth grade, I was the only kid in the class. So that's how small the little school was.
Wow.
But I grew up, just ranching and not managing a ranch or anything, but just working on the ranch with my family. And I always thought, I think, that I would come back and follow in Dad's footsteps and just continue doing that. And then the ranch had a policy that we needed to leave for at least 5 years if we thought we might want to come back, even if we thought we might want to come back. So I had no idea what for a career, but I did a year in metallurgy at a little college, and then I transferred and ended up doing a bachelor's degree in biology, still kind of just doing things that I thought were interesting and might provide a broad base. And then I did a bachelor's degree in philosophy, and then I went to Boston and did a master's degree in theology. And I thought I might be a priest. And in the meantime, I had a lot of friends on the East Coast who were curious about the West and about agriculture, about meat and its effect on health, about livestock and their effect on the environment. And I was really interested in social justice. We spent some time and taken little trips one to Honduras that I remember really well, and one to El Salvador. And in both cases, just realized how critical that the way we use resources affects people's lives. And so I started to think about agriculture as so fundamental to, if we cannot avoid spoiling land where we live and where we manage land, the land that supports us, then we're going to be bound to exploit people elsewhere. So I just was really interested in, man, is it possible to have a growth-based economy on a fixed rock? We know on the ranch that you can't. A field, no matter how well managed, has a certain carrying capacity. And so I became really interested in this question of ecological economics.
Mm-hmm.
How can we make a food system that better supports stewardship? And my dad and some other producers started this company. It was a cooperative called Salt of the Earth Ranchers Cooperative to try and get out of the commodity system. And right about that time, I was trying to figure out what to do after grad school. I was teaching at this little undergrad that I had gone to, Carroll College in Helena, and these guys were starting a cooperative, Salt of the Earth Ranchers Cooperative, and their goal was to get outside of the commodity system, and they were going to use cull cows and bulls, aggregate them, try to sell like a low-cost domestic grass-fed product to the Chipotles of the world was the goal.
Mm-hmm.
So I went to work for them, started learning how to price cattle. We started designing how we were going to aggregate cattle, finding a packer to work with. That was in Greeley, Colorado. And for the next 5 years, that was 2011. And for the next 5 years, I worked for that and got a bath in the meat industry and a bath in business. And we failed after 5 years. And for me, it was a chance to go and see a little bit different part of the system. I went to work for a policy organization called Western Landowners Alliance. We worked on Farm Bill and Endangered Species Act and state wildlife migration policy. And I got to see from a different end, like some of these enabling conditions that either allow you to make money while taking good care of the land or not. And that whole time I was sort of stewing about how to do meat better the next time. And so during COVID, I started writing a business plan, left that job, and Old Salt Co-op started about 4 years ago now.
Cool.
That's how
Wow.
I'm arrived here today.
I love the journey. First of all, kudos to your family for saying you got to leave for 5 years and have that experience. I mean, it might be hard. I can imagine when you're a young person being kind of kicked out of the nest, so to speak. But to go do that and to experience the world and go to the East Coast. I did a similar thing. I left California, went to the East Coast. It was really enlightening for me and changed my life. And it sounds like it did the same for you. And I just love the things that you studied. I mean, what a nice mixture of science and philosophy and theology. I mean, what a beautiful set of things to give you a holistic view of the world. So wow, neat story. I love that. And you must have a very cool family. And why I'm interested in the Old Salt Co-op name. Can you just tell us about that?
Yeah, well, Salt of the Earth Ranchers Cooperative, that was the failed project. I always kind of liked the principle behind that. Salt of the Earth people, the idea that you could that people can enhance landscapes like salt in a recipe, but it was too much of a mouthful. So we shortened it up, and it's just culinary enough that it works pretty well with meat. And so it's really around that aspiration to be Salt of the Earth is the aspiration, actually enhanced creation by being in right relationship.
Mm-hmm. Good. That's cool. I like it. Let's dive in now. Why don't you describe for everybody what the co-op does? It's an interesting model. There have been a few models like this in the country, and I'm just curious about, you describing for people what the different elements of it are, because it's interesting.
Yeah, well, we're a meat company, but we really have 5 different businesses. There is a meat processing business, very small. We have a tiny little custom exempt and retail exempt plant in the Helena city limits that has no slaughter facility. So we have to bring animals to a third-party USDA slaughter. We pick up carcasses, we bring them back, age them, cut and wrap, and then we sell direct to consumer. So that's one thing that we do. We have an online e-commerce brand. We also, by the way, with our processing facility, we'll do wild game, we'll do some 4-H. We process some cold deer for the city of Helena that goes to the food bank. So a variety of things. The first enterprise we did was really to test the market with our brand and this, how much would the city of Helena and the community around here show up for local food. And so it was just a burger joint called Old Salt Outpost. And it's a very simple, fast casual. We lease a space within a bar, but it moves, after we're almost 3 years in now, and it moves between 600 and 900 pounds of ground beef a week. It's been more than 1,000 people in per week who we get to talk to, and they get familiar with the concept. And really the idea was an initial enterprise where we could demonstrate some traction and create some cash flow. And then right across the street, just 3 months ago, we opened our next restaurant, which is called The Union by Old Salt. It's a wood-fired grill and a butcher shop, and it's a place that we own and can more kind of fully host people in a space where we curate everything from the decor to the hospitality. So there's a little butcher shop market in that space, and then that's an 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. thing, and then there's a wood-fired grill, and that's like evening dinner activation. And then the final thing we do, which we just got done with, the second iteration, was Old Salt Festival, and it happens over the solstice, and it happens on my family's ranch. And this year we had a little over 2,000 people there for 3 days of overnight wood-fired cooking. It's really centered around food. There's music, 18 bands. There's a whole tent where we have speaking about water and soil and wildlife conservation and different topics of interest. There's a general store, we call it, which is a tent full of artisans who are making things out of leather and wool. They're making knives, they're making art. And we have pasture walks and mule packing demos and iron forging demos. And so it's really meant to be a celebration of the culture that it takes for regenerative agriculture to get a foothold. So those are the 5 things we do. Mm-hmm. And what we really our North Star is to return more value to the stewardship of land. And so we're trying to take the value that is in the supply chain and shift as much as we can towards the producer, while still making sure that we treat workers well, and that obviously investors have to make sure that it makes sense for them too. But we started life as a cooperative association. It's a Chapter 15 Montana Cooperative Association. And then we realized that we were doing too many things. It was too complex. Instead, we formed a parent company called Old Salt Co-op LLC. And that LLC, we built cooperative principles into its operating agreement. And so the major way that Old Salt is different is that First of all, the board is controlled majority by producers and the producers that supply Old Salt by rule. And then second thing is that once we have paid off investors with their preferred return, about half of the distributions from the parent company, so from all the individual enterprises, go back to the producers pro rata. So they sell their animal to the company, and then down the road, if we've paid back the preferred return to investors, then the producers can share in a significant portion of the margin from the restaurants, the processing enterprise, the brand itself. And I think that's a big part of our value set, is that regenerative agriculture is not magic. It's not you choose, are you going to do regenerative practices? Or are you going to do conventional practices? Choosing to do regenerative is you've got to have ability and aptitude, and then you got to stick with it over time and iterate and suffer. And, it's hard. And so you don't just choose to do it, just like you can't just choose to be a amazing piano player or whatever. You have to cultivate, this way of making yourself into someone who can manage complex ecosystems and still be agriculturally productive. And that takes money. And so we really feel like, replenishing land means bringing more value back to the production. It doesn't just mean choosing this in a binary way, like, oh yeah, of course, I would prefer just to choose regenerative agriculture. You really have to feed it with resources in order for regenerative agriculture to actually happen, to take effect.
Mm-hmm. So that's interesting. So all the ranches that are a part of the co-op, they're practicing regenerative. They're in this journey of regenerative.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So I would say that, we say the one-liner about Old Salt is that we are a regenerative agriculture for damn fine Montana meat. And that might sound odd, that kind of wording to people, but we really think that I don't like to talk about just regenerative practices, because by themselves, they're not enough. If tomorrow all the farms and ranches in the country were the LeBron James of agriculture and they were all incredible managers, the extractive food system, the rest of the whole that they sell into, would eventually put them out of business.
Right.
Or drive them to not be regenerative anymore.
Right.
And so, yes, the ranch, as you know, the regenerative is a spectrum, but yes, the ranches are all, whether it is working on to restore beaver habitat in the uplands, in our part of Montana, none of our producers are crop raisers.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost completely livestock. So sheep and cattle primarily, with some hogs. One of our producers raises a couple hundred hogs for us every year. But we're talking about 5 members right now, 5-member ranches, about 300,000 acres of under management of private, public lease, and private lease.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe 6,000 head of cattle between them. And Old Salt only moves about 5% of what they all produce. They're primarily dependent still on commodity markets, and our North Star is to provide as much alternative as we can by building a brand that can move product.
Mm-hmm. That's good. That's smart. I mean, you've named all the real challenges. You can be a great land steward, but the market's going to kill you if you don't have your own market. And basically what you're doing, it sounds incrementally building your own market to get more and more of that percentage of those 6,000 head, so that in time you have a nice revenue stream that's paying people a premium for doing their good work and allowing them to invest in the way they need to. And, one of the promises of regenerative that I do hear is that eventually you arrive to a place where you have much less inputs because you've got the system up into its dynamic equilibrium, so to speak. Are you one that believes that's possible? I mean, I know you got to upgrade, your fencing and your water systems. So there's always investment. You got to pay your people. Now you have a set of businesses that are going to need continuous investment. But are you one who believes that over time you're going to be having to invest less in the stewardship and more in the infrastructure, so to speak?
Well, I do think that you can get the ecosystem to a place where you are using less inputs and it's more productive. I've seen that. For example, we've, over the past, on my own family's ranch, over the past 10 years, let's say, on 3 different pivots where we intensively grazed during the summertime for our grass-finished beef program. When we took fertilizer out of the equation entirely, we saw a decrease in production for a few years, but the intensity and then the rest that we were able to get, now we're more productive than we were at the beginning with no fertilizer.
Yep.
It's a very specific circumstance. In this case, we're using flood irrigated water that comes from a reservoir that is then gravity fed through these pivots. You've got a lot of water. Our area, we've got, if we're lucky, 60 days of growing season. And the uplands, we're basically, the Blackfoot Valley is the bed of an old lake, basically. And then the shores of that lake are the sagebrush upland of ground that we manage. And that ground takes an incredible investment in water infrastructure in order to graze it exactly the way you'd want to. And some of that investment in water infrastructure we're doing as we speak. But still, its metabolism burns slower, especially the west and south facing aspects are going to be drier. Its metabolism is only so high. And so I do think that, particularly with degraded land, you can fill up that sink, but there's an asymptote that you reach in efficiency. I don't believe that regenerative agriculture is this thing that allows you to get blood from a rock.
Yeah.
It's not magic. You still have to capture energy, and energy doesn't come from nowhere. And I think it will always take thoughtful management, and thoughtful management can only be done by human beings, and human beings only have so much management. And so I think it is as much a human solution. We talk about the solution being more eyes, like eyeballs per acre, because observation and iteration and talent applied over time. It's really, it's a craft, it's an art. And that means that part of stewardship is always going to be making sure that those human beings can make a living. And that means money, rather than sort of being able to take all the cost out of it. The people are a big part of the cost, and I think they're an important part of the cost.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. I like that analysis. And I think it's true that the thing you said about perception, one of the things that I think is really interesting about all of agriculture now is this deepening of our perception. Part of it is science, part of it is the environment's forcing it, part of it is the increase in consumer demand to understand their food, and the ranchers and the farmers are part of that dialogue of telling them about that food. So I do deeply appreciate the increasing focus on perception, really trying to understand. It's almost like an indigenization of agriculture. Like we're going back to the deep perception that a lot of the indigenous population had to have in order to survive. They had to totally understand the land.
Absolutely. And it's a different way of perceiving, like you said, and valuing the rest of the living world that we're a part of. And so Old Salt says land is kin, and we see that as, that's our sort of tagline. We see that as really an indigenous value set, not just an indigenous American value set, but really a value set that can be found in different cultures across the globe. There are people who see the other critters and even the natural systems as being more siblings, more mother, more father than thing and asset. And I think that's really critical. There's just a fundamentally different way that you relate to something that is a thing and an asset than something that's alive and something that is sort of kin.
We hope you're enjoying the conversation. If you are, please rate our podcast and offer a review. Your voice will help us grow our listener base, which helps us sustain the funding to share these conversations with the people and organizations shaping a more just and regenerative future. A future in which the food and farm businesses are helping to solve the largest challenges of our time.
Let's talk a little bit about what you're hearing from your customer base. Are you feeling encouraged by the growth? Are you feeling that you're getting to where you want? The pace of growth, is it, are you satisfied, or do you need more, or how are you on all that?
Oh yeah, we certainly need more. I think in order for our business model to work, the sweet spot is between 15 and 20 million of sales a year. And, to give you a sense of where we're at now, like 2.5 million of sales a year. And we've got a long ways to go, but I'm very encouraged by how far we've come, how as quickly as we've come. Our e-commerce meat has only been live for a little, maybe a year and a half. My family has a program called Mannix beef, and we sell a few hundred animals locally per year. It's about, for us individually as a ranch, it's about 25% of what we raise, we sell locally. But we came to this point where we either needed to step back. We're managing enough complexity that, changing water and moving cows and fencing, and it was a lot. But so we either needed to step back, which we didn't want to do. We had 600 customers. We liked those local relationships. It took us 20 years. But at the same time, we've exceeded the processing capacity locally. And to grow as significantly as you would need to grow, there's kind of this valley of death where there's a middle ground where it's just not viable. You have to, take on overhead and expense faster than the increased revenue justifies. And so, for example, a processing plant, even though we didn't have many good options for anything beyond 300 head a year, to build our own meant that you'd had to run 2,000 a year through it. So where Old Salt kind of came from is me outside of the family ranch, living in town, but working for a meat company that the family was part of, saying, well, what if we find some producers with similar values and we join forces, we raise capital together, we build our own processing together, and most importantly, we build a brand that can keep that processing busy together. And so we joined forces, and we've taken on, almost $3 million of private equity, and we've taken on a bunch of debt, and that means we've got to get to a certain scale in order to pay back that note. We don't aspire to become the scale and the size where we become the problem we're trying to fight. I think there's a sweet spot in terms of growth and size. We feel like that's likely to be in that 15 to 20 million range. We don't want to scale past the point where we have a chance to have intimacy with the customer, and for them to have some context for where we're at and just who we are and where this part of Montana is. And if we are successful, let's say we reach our 5-year goal, which is to sell to 5,000 direct customers on the meat side, then I'm more interested in the prospect of maybe helping more of these little hubs that are vertically integrated and have their own customer producers and customers who are connected in their own little microeconomy. I think we're more interested in that than getting to 50 million in sales. We are in the process. The other thing we're doing right now is that we bought a property in March to build a new USDA facility, which we don't currently have. So I have a grant, and I've applied for more federal financing, and we'll have to raise more private capital to get that little facility up and running about 20 minutes north of Helena, where I'm based. That facility, probably 2,500 head a year, is its sweet spot. And so getting it up to capacity, I think our own brand would ideally makes up at least half of that. And the rest comes from third-party farms and ranches nearby who have their own brands.
Yeah, that's ambitious. I like it. You have a 5-year plan, and then you'll start to, this is kind of the success story you're beginning to tell me, is like, you'll know when you're up to 2,500 and you hit 15 to 20 million in sales, you'll be able to say, okay, we achieved our goals. We've become successful in the way that we envisioned.
Well, those are the levels of gross sales that I think it will take. But the real measure of success will be, are we returning $300 to $400 per beef equivalent more to the cow-calf producer than their best commodity alternative? And for me, the goal beyond that is I want to triple ranch net income for the ranches near me. And I think that's achievable. The first way it's achievable is to get the existing livestock they already sell outside of the commodity system and sell to our own customer base and make them essentially a stakeholder in each part of the margin in the process. The second thing is that I want to take these were historically sheep ranches. And my family's is a good example. We were a sheep ranch until, I want to say about the war, and then cattle since then. The last 15 or so years, we really struggled with knapweed, and we treated that knapweed with Tordon up until about 15 years ago. But we started bringing in sheep. We got a grant from the Sheep Institute, and we found somebody that owned first it was goats, and later it was sheep. And we'd bring about 1,500 head per year from July 1st to September 1, and they would graze knapweed, and we would target them to eat the knapweed seed heads right as before that they set seed. And the goal was, deplete the seed bank. And for like 11, 12 years, we saw almost no change.
Wow.
Knowing, we did a lot of research with the university, and we were getting we were getting like 95% capture. And in year 13, the knapweed population started to crash.
Wow.
And today, like for us, it's a real success story because the knapweed is just another plant that you may find in that 6,000 acres of dry land. And it's a much more diverse ecosystem. And now the next step is to be able to to own those sheep and sell the meat. So the first sort of step in the way I think we can triple the net income of these ranches, first is to sell their beef outside commodities. Second is to begin to stack enterprises. And
Mhm.
third, I think, is to start aggregating. They all use a monitoring system of one type or another. One is ranch advisory partners. They use the thing called the bullseye method. Another one is the thing called snaplands.
Yeah, snaplands, I know that. Yeah.
And they're setting up transects across the different ecotypes. They're
Mhm.
doing their best to measure the effect of their stewardship and tweak that over time. But
Mhm.
I think by potentially gaining access to biodiversity markets, if those ever become a thing, before that, I think voluntary carbon markets may be viable for us given the scale we're operating on. I
Mhm.
think also like maybe pooling our resources and creating our own little self-insurance company. So
Mhm.
instead of paying on the general market for liability insurance, if the co-op members who we get are maybe a little safer than average, it might make sense for us to run our own insurance. And I think those things over time, that pooling of this little set of infrastructure can add up. Our family's ranch, and this is like one of the core problems in agriculture. There's two entities that own the land, and we've just inherited that. We've added to it by putting conservation easements on the land we already have, and then on the land we're trying to buy,
Mhm.
and which is terminal. You can't keep doing that, obviously, once everything's under easement, which it now is.
Mhm.
But essentially, we've inherited a bunch through the generations, and then we've added to it a little bit with conservation easements, and there's going to be no more adding to it. And the reason for that is because the cash that ag produces, as many people now know, doesn't come close to justifying the real estate cost.
Right.
But just to give an example, the two landholding entities, one's a C corp and one's an LLC on my family's place. The land there might sell for between 30 and 40 million.
Mhm.
Just the operating entity. So the operating entity is a third entity and it owns the cattle and the equipment.
Mhm.
Just that operating entity, add up the cows and what market price is on cows and the equipment is like 5 million.
Mhm.
That in a good year for us produces about 300,000 of net income.
Right.
And that's before you replace any equipment. And that's assuming that you paid family members about $1,500 a month. So it's like minimal wages
Right.
and the houses are owned by the ranch itself. So
Mhm.
my point is like that 300,000 of net income, it's probably once you replace some equipment and give people a living wage, it's more like 150.
Mhm.
That income will never buy even the operating entity for 5 million, right?
Right.
Even with a 30-year loan at 2%.
Right.
So the core challenge in keeping these places intact and not just have people cash out and give up
Right.
to make the economics a little bit more viable. I don't think we're ever going to get back to a point where the ag value can buy the land.
Mhm.
But man, instead of 300,000 a year, I think 900,000 a year makes it a much more viable. And I
Yeah.
think this little vertically integrated company might be able to make some big steps towards that.
Yeah, I really appreciate, and I think a lot of people that will be listening to this will really appreciate the reality that you're bringing to the challenge, because it is a huge challenge. And it's because of the way we've designed the food system that we have today. And what you're saying is there's an alternative model out there. And what I think you're hopefully inspiring people to do is to take a similar journey in their different places, because that's what you described. And I think that that creates resilience too. It's healthier when and if, and I'm sure we will one day have another one of those experiences like we had with COVID, where, it's a major problem that dislocates a lot of businesses that are centralized and concentrated. It keeps the system more viable by having this re-regionalization of food systems. And so I'm really happy to hear that. And I mean, was it those years of studying that brought this to you? What were your inspirations to pursue this path? I know that you described the economics, which can, I mean, that's a huge motivator, right? To change the economics, because it's devastatingly difficult. It's actually shameful in my mind that we have allowed this to happen with with our agrarian communities to have this happen is unbelievable and so short-sighted. But what's inspired you over the years?
Well, so many things. I mean, certainly reading Wendell Berry in graduate school was big for me. My brother and I took a little pilgrimage when I graduated back through Kentucky by his farm, and he wrote a lot about Wallace Stegner and boomers and stickers. And I think the stickers idea is so inspirational. This idea that we all get on Elon Musk's spaceship is not very inspiring to me. It's like, I don't want to be a species that is sort of hopelessly destined to just spoil the nest and find the new place. I think it's much more hopeful to figure out culturally, can we progress to a point where we learn to live within our means? And I think that's sort of worth everything. I think part of it comes from just the experience of failure with the first meat company I worked for. We were trying to do a good thing by returning more value to stewardship. That was the mission in the beginning. There was 120 ranches that signed up for this cooperative. And the idea was that we were going to be a low-cost grass-fed producer for the Chipotles of the world. And so we were aggregating cattle, bringing them to Greeley, and selling to this brand called Hillary's Eat Well in Kansas. And she was buying semi-loads of grass-fed beef trim for a thing called the Omnivore Burger. She was a veggie burger company, but she was blending grass-fed beef with sweet potato and flax and other things. And in a matter of 2 months, 3 things happened that together put us out of business. One, country of origin labeling was repealed in Congress, and we lost our sort of low-cost domestic value proposition because domestic didn't mean as much. We're not going to be the low-cost producer overall. That would go to Australia or Uruguay. And second thing, our packer had a heart attack and died.
Oh, shoot. Wow.
Relatively small facility, but he had 2 things, a slaughter and a grinding facility in Fort Morgan. And his wife called me one day and she said, we've got to sell that facility. And so that happened. And then the third thing happened was that our major buyer, Hillary's Eat Well, her majority ownership changed and the new board sort of took things in a different direction. And so almost overnight, we didn't own anything. And so we didn't have a lot of risk. We were just sort of a virtual brand. But at the same time, it didn't feel like local food to me. And it wasn't resilient because I was still on the phone with somebody in Greeley talking to them about the storage warehouse near Denver where pallets of our meat that I'd never seen, where I was trying to represent those same pallets to a buyer in Meridian, Idaho. And that's not local food to me. Yeah. And the opposite of what we were doing there is rather than being this brand that tries to convince people because you're grass-fed and don't have growth hormones and some certain attributes, trying to convince them to buy our brand rather than somebody else's because of a certain set of claims on labels. Mm-hmm. The opposite of that is to really just take a risk, stick your neck out, and own a bunch of brick and mortar closer to home and get to know customers who are much closer to you and who have a chance of knowing you. And it's risky because now you own brick and mortar and you could fail. And now you've got a bunch of employees and you could fail. On the other hand, it's tremendously rewarding because now you're working with real people that you see every day and who you can see the impact on their lives. Today, we have a little over 50 people. And I can't claim that, hey, we're successful and we're still a startup, but we actually have a fighting chance. And I can see the impact in my own communities. And when our customers are curious about what makes you different, I can point them to the exact landscapes where the animals are being raised. It's as traceable as it gets. And the festival allows me in particular to have an annual event that I can point to that's held on one of those ranches and gets a couple thousand people out where people are actually smelling the soil and actually seeing the valley and seeing the little riparian areas and being able to judge for themselves, is this trustworthy, rather than trying to use a label and claims to essentially sell through the same commodity channels that are extractive, just a shinier product. Instead of just putting a different grass-fed product and thinking that the product is the thing that is fundamentally different, it's the entire system that has to be fundamentally different. And so that's why in this iteration, I felt like it's not enough to just change the product, and it's still not enough to change what's happening on the land, but you actually have to rebuild the entire little micro food system that can sustain you. And the whole thing has to be regenerative because there's no such thing as anything regenerative in a vacuum. Like it's the system that's either healthy or not. So yeah, I guess how shallow that first business, there was many good intentions, a lot of good people, but the business model itself was the opposite of resilient. And I think it wouldn't have made, even if it would have worked, it wouldn't have been systemic change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I can see that. And what you're talking about, the slow food movement uses this idea of food community. You're creating a food community, a community of people who are related. And you used the term earlier, I noted this intimacy with your customers. And the thing that I think about with intimacy is that there's a shared vulnerability
Yeah.
in intimacy. And so you're vulnerable because you're dependent on them, but they are vulnerable because you're their source of meat and they are trusting you to deliver to them something that they truly want. So I like that. And I really appreciate your ability to articulate kind of the depth of this challenge, the complexity of it and the need for it and the upside of it. But you're living with risk. But you said something. You're loving your life right now in a certain way, it sounds like. I mean, it's meaningful work.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the status quo feels riskier than almost any risk that that we could take on. And living with this existential angst, like the world's going to hell in a handbasket and you have no control over anything, is very hard. So it feels good to, even if you don't, I'm not going to change the world. Nobody by themselves is, but if you can find a little area within your zone of influence where you feel like, hey, this little thing can make a difference to my community in some way, my context, the things that I can see and touch, my limited capacity, I could see how this helps make this little community a little bit more stable and resilient. That's very freeing. And at the festival, one of my heroes, Fred Provenza, gave I think maybe what it is his last talk. He said that, we do need exercise and we do need good nutrition, but one of the things that we also need is community and connection to other people, and we need meaning. So we don't live by bread alone. And I think that's one of the things that the industrial way of thinking about food as just this input that we need. And if you just change it and make it a better input, then we're going to be healthy all of a sudden. But it's far deeper change than that. And so I was inspired by how Fred speaks about becoming communities again, like all across the country. That's not an industrial process.
No,
There's
it's a
only one.
biological, cultural process.
Right.
And that's the whole problem with industrial food systems is that they don't appreciate that food is a biological process and it's a biological paradigm. It has to be if it's going to be healthy. And industrialization is all about elimination of diversity, which is the opposite of what evolution and healthy ecosystems need. They need diversity. So it's just never was. I mean, I understand how they ended up there because people were looking how to make. There were people that were really focused on maximizing profits, and they developed a system that maximizes profit. But there are a lot of downsides, and rural communities have really experienced those downsides all across the United States. And what you're doing is really important because it is that rebuilding of community, which is what our country needs right now. I mean, we are so polarized, it's absolutely insane. And part of the reason we are polarized is because we have exploited big pieces of the country. I believe we have exploited the Midwest, particularly, and the South, and rural communities in California. I mean, it's a bummer. And I'm hoping that the approach that you're taking as things get more intense, as I think they will. I just lived through a week of over 100. It was 117 here the other day. I mean, that is insane. And it's not sustainable. We've got to deal with it. And I really am hoping that the work that you're doing and other people are doing it in other places around the country, it is happening. It's like little seeds and they're popping up, and eventually, hopefully, they will impact the whole country so that we can get back to something that's more viable and more enriching, really enriching. But I want you to talk about how people can get to your meat and your products and come to your festival next year. I might even try and do that. I have a cousin that lives in Redfish, and I need to get over to Montana, so I'll join you. So share with people how they can get a hold of you and get your products.
Yeah, they can find us at oldsaltcoop.com. And so co-op is the only nuance there. But if you Google that, you'll find it. There's a page for our meat products. There's a page for our festival, which happens every year now on the solstice. It's a 3-day festival in the Blackfoot Valley of Western Montana on my family's place. And we just did agree we're doing it again. And so I'm very excited about that. It's really kind of a unique event. And then another great way for people to get to know us, if you're within striking distance, is to come have a meal at the Union by Old Salt downtown Helena, or at our burger shop, The Outpost, right across the street. And if you want to reach out and visit with me, just send an email to Cole, COLE, at oldsaltcoop.com. CO-OP is the co-op part.com.
Great. Well, Cole, it's been a great pleasure. I really wish you all the best in this very exciting venture. And that front page article in the New York Times was awesome, or that big article in the New York Times, which I saw, and Doris actually saw and said, hey, you got to look at this. And I did. And that's how we all came together. And really, really appreciate your good work, and look forward to future contact.
Well, thanks for having me on, Michael. It was great to visit with you.
Thank you for listening. Roots of Change is a program of the Public Health Institute.